This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this episode 999 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by DraftKings. Thanks for tuning in. Football season is right around the corner, and there's no better way to lock in your fantasy dominance early than with Best Ball on DraftKings, where you draft once and ride your roster all season long. And right now, DraftKings is giving all customers a can't-miss offer. Draft one, get one. Enter a lineup in the $15 million Best Ball contest for just $20, and you'll score another Best Ball ticket to play free for a share of that $15 million, giving you a second chance to win big. It's easy. Just draft your dream team once, no weekly management required, and let your top scorers automatically start each week. Across the whole season, every breakout star, every clutch play, every touchdown will count towards your quest of a share of that $15 million. As you know, I'm drafting over there and I'm documenting things with becoming a Best Ball bro. So you can use that information from that show to help you out as well. So download the DraftKings Daily Fantasy app now to draft your $20 Best Ball lineup to play for a share of $15 million. And get a second ticket to play free for a share of that $15 million. That's two chances to win big without ever setting your lineup again. Draft one, get one, only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 8778-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY to 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. 18 plus in most eligible states, but age varies by jurisdiction. Eligibility restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. One per customer. Enter the Best Ball $15 million headliner contest by 9/4/25 to get one bonus entry. $20 entry required. Reward expires in 30 days. See terms at DraftKings.com/NFL-best-ball. Sponsored by DK. I've been distancing myself from the concept of the running back dead zone a bit this year. And really, it extended from some research that I did last year. Anyone who's been consuming everything that I've been doing might have picked up on that, with the dead zone looking different in 2024 than it had in the past pre-draft. But beyond that, I think we've done a little bit too much generalizing with the running back dead zone. The intent on my end was to use it as more of a quick reference, to quickly explain that there's an area of fantasy drafts where running back hit rates start to decline, and there's no reason to reach for running backs in that area of your draft. And that's still true. But as I've alluded to recently on the show, I've found myself constantly finding player archetypes who end up emerging from the dead zone over and over again. It's more of an archetype zone than it is a dead zone at the end of the day. And it's probably easier to think of it that way versus how the dead zone is often framed. Now, as you saw with the title of today's episode, we're not talking about running backs, but we are talking about dead zones. Because there's something that I've been talking about for years and that other analysts have been talking about for years, but it still doesn't seem to get enough love in the fantasy football space. We can call it the tight end dead zone. I don't really care. That was just the easiest way to sort of get the concept of this episode across in a title. I'll probably eventually do the same thing that I'm doing with the running back dead zone and say, let's stop calling it that in like 5 or 6 years. But regardless of those semantics, there's definitely an area of your drafts where you should think twice before snagging a tight end. That's what this is all about. This episode is going to strongly lean on the late round draft guide. I put a lot of research into that thing, and you can get your copy right now over on lateround.com. You can see all of the data from today's show in action, and you can see how it impacts this season in particular. But this episode, the data in the episode, it's going to largely stem from that guide. It's just a fraction of what you get in that guide too. But the tight end dead zone, let's talk about this idea. Last year in 2024, the tight end landscape was different in fantasy football. I podcasted about it, I wrote about it, and I was also more or less wrong with the conclusion that I drew from my research. You win some, you lose some. Essentially, we were looking at a tight end group last year that was cheaper than it had ever really been, or at least the top of the position was. The tight end one was being drafted 11 overall spots later than the average that we had seen from 2014 to 2023. The tight end 2 was being drafted later as well, as was the tight end 3. But then when you got to the tight end 4, the tight end 5, the tight end 6, the tight end 4 to the tight end 8 were all drafted higher than we'd typically seen. To put that all another way, tight ends were bunched together last year at the top of drafts. You might remember that. It was guys like Kelsey, McBride, Andrews, Pitts, Kincaid. the market couldn't make up its mind. There weren't obvious go-tos at the position, but there were a lot of candidates to be those go-tos. And my takeaway was that even when you remove Travis Kelce and Rob Gronkowski from historical data, we often did see high-end tight ends emerge in fantasy football. So chances were a couple of those high-end players would do the same thing last year, and you were getting them at a discount, which was kind of nice. But we didn't get enough breakouts or big seasons from that group. We did get Trey McBride and George Kittle. But then the other player who came through, who really emerged as this big superstar, was Brock Bowers. He was drafted a little bit later. Basically, I thought maybe we'd see like 3 early round guys hit. But it was just 2. And it wasn't the 2 that were drafted at the very top. Kittle wasn't a top 3 tight end by ADP. Some R-squared analysis really paints this picture. R-squared is the coefficient of determination in mathematics. It's the proportion of the variation in the dependent variable that is predictable from the independent variable or variables. Basically, an R-squared of 1 or 100% means there's perfect correlation and that one variable explains the other variable perfectly. At 0 or 0%, the opposite is happening. Now, I like doing average draft position analysis through the lens of R-squared. I look at positional ADP, and then I look at PPR points per game by players in a given season. I then find the R-squared between those 2 variables. That essentially tells us how much average draft position helped explain a player's actual result. Let's think about why this is so important. Imagine a world where top 5 running backs were consistently giving you a massive edge over your competition, like year in and year out. You knew that having a top 5 running back was a big deal, which it is. That may make you want to draft running backs early in your fantasy drafts, right? However, what if the R-squared between running back average draft position and running back actual result was next to nothing? Meaning, where you drafted your running back, it wasn't really explaining how well that running back would end up performing. Then you probably wouldn't care to draft one early, because you could just get one later who would finish with just as good of odds to be the RB1, to be a top 5 guy. Back when late round quarterbacking was the most obvious fantasy strategy on the planet, if you go back to 2015, there was no correlation between a top 18 quarterback and how many points per game he actually scored. Top 9 quarterbacks that year were no better than the next 9 quarterbacks by ADP. In that case, if you drafted a quarterback early, you were drafting a terrible fantasy value. So think about that with tight ends. If you look at top 12 tight ends by average draft position, let's say, and there's really strong correlation between a tight end being selected in the top 12 and how many fantasy points per game that tight end actually scored, then that's better for early round tight end drafters. Because it's telling them and showing them that the earlier the pick, generally speaking, the higher the points per game output. And through the years, you get variation with this kind of thing. Some years, like in 2017, you'll get great correlation among top 12 tight ends. That year saw an R-squared of 0.73 when looking at top 12 tight ends and where they were drafted versus how many fantasy points they actually scored. And then sometimes you get the 2024 season. Last year, we had absolutely zero correlation, an R-squared value of literally 0 between top 12 tight ends, where they were drafted, and how many PPR points per game they actually scored. They were totally unpredictable thanks to Brock Bowers' performance on one end and then some busts on the other end. So that helps explain what I was talking about when I said last year's results weren't the best for tight end drafters. You could have just thrown a dart at a top 12 tight end and had just as good of a shot at a tight end 1 season as someone drafting the actual tight end 1 by ADP. That's essentially what that's saying. Now, heading into 2025, things have normalized a bit. We've got a more clear-cut tight end picture. It looks like a tight end landscape that we're generally used to seeing, with a few obvious guys at the top. What I want to look at and discuss is doing the same R-squared exercise, but for tight ends outside the obvious elite tier. The elite tier where we've had Gronkowski and Kelce and Andrews and a lot of Kittle in the past. In the draft guide, I labeled this area as tight ends drafted after tight end 6 and through tight end 18. These were the non-elite tight ends who were selected in most fantasy drafts. They're the guys who aren't your primary targets, but they're still players who are either high-end backups or actual starters on your fantasy team. Since 2014, which is where the ADP data from fantasydata.com dates back to, we've had 115 tight ends drafted in that tight end 7 to tight end 18 area who played 8 or more games in their analyzed season. So if a player didn't play 8 or more games, he's not part of this data set. We want to have a meaningful sample to judge someone's performance. So 115 sort of middle to late round tight ends. Anyone want to guess the R squared between those tight ends' average draft positions and the tight ends' PPR points per game averages? 0.04. It's essentially non-existent. To put that another way, the high-end part of that sample, the guys ranked as the tight end 7, the tight end 8, the tight end 9, historically, the low part of that sample has done pretty much just as well. And that low-end part of the sample is the tight end 15, 16, 17, and 18 by ADP. And that tells you that there's almost zero reason to reach for players in this range when you know there's no correlation between where these dudes are being drafted and how they actually perform. But just like the running back dead zone, there are archetypes that you should be looking for, players who can still emerge from this range. For instance, tight ends in this range, the 115 that we're analyzing here, when they've been in bad offenses, they've been very bad against cost. 24 tight ends from this range were in offenses that scored fewer than 2 offensive touchdowns per game. Of those 24, there's only been one who beat his average draft position expectation by 4 or more PPR points per game. Meaning where he was drafted said he should have scored X number of points per game and he exceeded that by 4 or more points. Only one of the 24 in a bad offense was able to do that. And that one tight end was freaking Brock Bowers, one of the best tight end prospects of this era. Now, another thing to think about in this range is age. Just like the running back dead zone, the younger the tight end, the better the outcomes generally are. And then arguably most important, you've got teammate competition. There are a lot of ways to measure this, but the way I do this in the guide is by simply looking at how many teammate wide receivers the tight end has in the top 48 at the wide receiver position. That's by ADP. When there's more competition, we generally see worse outcomes for these tight ends. In fact, when tight ends have more competition, their likelihood of breaking out and far exceeding ADP expectation is essentially cut in half. Now, when we see that there's no correlation between where a tight end 7 to tight end 18 is drafted and how many PPR points per game that tight end's actually going to score, we've got to wonder why. I always need some explanation when the data is saying something kind of wild. And I think the reason we see this kind of thing happening, this dead zone happening, I think it's even more obvious than it is at running back. Like with running backs, I've always said that it's a supply and demand thing. That's why the running back dead zone has been a thing historically. Fantasy gamers know how important running back is, and they push up players who shouldn't be pushed up based on projected workload. But those players are often inferior talents. They're not locked into that workload. There are only so many bell cows in the NFL, making it harder for those dead zone running backs to give us a truly elite fantasy season. The masses draft Zamir White as an RB2 when there's absolutely no reason to draft Zamir White as an RB2. It's kind of the same idea for tight ends. Not many tight ends are projected to see high target shares. So the highly targeted tight ends, they're pretty rare. But tight ends also just score fewer points. Their points are scrunched together, which means one touchdown, one big play, one broken play, and all of a sudden, that tight end is usable in a given week. Now, I haven't played the new Mario Kart, but I imagine it's like that, where everyone's in their spot, they all have their kind of place in the race, and then the items start getting used, and everything shifts back and forth constantly in the standings. It's like that. There's not much stability at tight end. Things are always moving. That creates a lot of variance among the players who aren't elite, who aren't seeing those massive target shares. And there are many, many players who fall into that category. There are very few who are actually seeing great target shares. Now, I talk plenty in the draft guide about the top 6 guys and whether you should be in or out on those guys this year. And I'm actually into some of the tight ends that are in this tight end 7 to tight end 18 range. But I do think people need to realize that traditionally, there's been a massive dead zone at tight end that stretches across many rounds of your fantasy draft. It tells you that generally speaking, if you're not getting a high-end tight end, an early round tight end, you really, really should wait. And you should really, really think deeply about that middle round tight end that you're about to draft, because oftentimes it's a really bad fantasy selection. And look, this is not a new concept, but it's one that all of us should be reminded about every once in a while. And this right now, this is your reminder. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. We're back on our normal schedule, so Becoming a Best Ball Bro will be out tomorrow. The Late Round Fantasy Football Show will be on YouTube on Thursday, which is on youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. And then I've got a great perspectives guest later in the week. And you can always check out what I'm doing over on lateround.com, including the draft guide, which you can purchase right now. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.